In a matter of minutes, Topeka, Kansas is reduced to rubble.
It was a half block wide that was just marching like this huge bulldozer through the town.
It was a tremendous roaring sound, and we each looked at each other, and I told him, I said, we're going to die.
A killer tornado tears through residential neighborhoods and moves on to the city center.
Everywhere you looked was total destruction. Houses, roofs, trees, cars, everything was destroyed.
To the left of me is a power line that's sparking. Straight in front of me is a water pipe that's shooting up into the air, and there are probably 500 people milling through all of this destruction.
No American city has ever suffered such devastation from a tornado. They lived in the heart of the so-called Tornado Alley, but many residents in Topeka, Kansas assumed they were protected by a 250-foot hill that overlooked the city. The hill is known as Burnett's Mound, named after Potawatomi Indian chief Abram Burnett, who had lived at the foot of the hill and was buried nearby. According to stories told by Chief Burnett, the hill has mystical powers.
Supposedly, back in the 1840s, a band of Potawatomis was hit by a tornado, and they buried the people that were killed on Burnett's Mound.
In addition to its supposed spiritual properties, the hill was also seen as a physical blockade. People thought that it would break up funnels as they swept across the plains. Although the city had been struck by 10 tornadoes since records were first kept, starting in 1897, the damage had been slight. Topeka became the capital city of Kansas in 1861, and by 1961, the population had risen to over 125,000. Homes were being built at the foot of Burnett's Mound. City planners decided that the large hill was the perfect site for the new water tower. Some Topekans complained that building on the sacred hill might affect its power to protect the city.
The legend says if anyone ever disturbs the mound, then it will no longer act as the talisman or the protector of the city.
Concerns were brushed aside, and the water tower was built. Contractors did not report uncovering any evidence of burial grounds during construction of the 5-million-gallon tank. Over the next few years, the controversy died down. On Wednesday, June 8, 1966, a law student named Bill Curtis had just completed his studies at Topeka's Washburn University. While taking classes to prepare for the Kansas bar exam, the 26-year-old Curtis was also working part-time as a newscaster for the local television station, WIBW.
On that particular night, a friend of mine asked me to fill in because he wanted to leave a day early for his vacation. I said that'd be easy to do. I'll skip the class on that night and go out and do the 6 o'clock news.
At 6:37 p.m., the station received reports of a small tornado in Manhattan, Kansas, 50 miles west of Topeka. Topeka was directly in the path of the storm. Curtis was given a bulletin to read to his viewers.
We didn't know the extent of the damage in Manhattan, but everybody should await the impending storm, still in a kind of a warning status, and not yet the full serious alert.
The National Weather Service and its volunteer storm spotters were dispatched around Topeka. John Meinholt was assigned to monitor the skies from one of the highest vantage points in the city, the top of Burnett's Mound.
I'd sit there for a few minutes and started observing the formation of what appeared to be a cloud that was getting kind of droopy out to the west. And I started reporting that to the Weather Bureau.
Meteorologists at the National Weather Service couldn't confirm the funnel cloud on radar. They relied on a modified military radar donated by the government after World War II. It was state-of-the-art for the time, but its ability to detect tornadoes was limited.
That radar is not going to identify circulation at the base of the cloud like the Doppler radar does now. It had to have something visual. It had to see the debris, it had to see the rain and the hail.
The equipment couldn't pick up the dark clouds as they began to rotate. At 6:55 p.m., a tornado dropped from the sky. 8 miles west of Topeka, Glenn Nicely was aware of the approaching storm. He had been outside working on his family farm when he saw the tornado racing towards him.
I had just put a horse in a barn and went to the house, and it was muddy, so I just sat down to take my boots off. It was probably 3/4 mile away when I saw it. Just a big black cloud, and dump truck and combine and building all up in the air.
Glenn, his wife, and 7-year-old daughter were living in a mobile home next to his mother's house. Neither had a basement. Glenn knew he had only seconds to get his family to safety in the crawl space under the garage.
I got the wife and the child in the crawl space, and my mother was arguing with me. She said it hadn't hit here in 50 years, wasn't gonna hit here now. About that time, the garage door went up, and I reached to grab it, and the whole house come in. It sounded like a railroad train had just gone over.
Neighbors had seen the funnel drop from the sky and followed it in their truck to the Nicely's home.
I got to my lower driveway, sucked the headlights out of their car, and they watched my horses go over a bunch of big pine trees that come out of the ground, he said, like carrots. The horses landed over across the road and took off running.
The neighbors heard Glenn's wife screaming and rushed to help pull the family out of the rubble. The touchdown at the Nicely's farm confirmed the fears of the National Weather Service. Now, the radar registered the debris in the air and gave them the first look at the monstrous funnel cloud.
We understood it was on the ground, it was going to do great damage. We didn't know how far it was going to move through the city, nor the exact path, but we knew that there was a tremendous danger for the city of Topeka.
At 7:03 p.m., the command was given to sound the sirens. Newscasters were told to give a tornado alert to the public.
It's in this part of the city right now.
We were off and running in the most serious broadcast of my life. Suddenly, this is it. You can't get away from it. I'm live on camera, and I can't run, and I can't hide.
The only thing that stood between the city and the tornado was Burnett's Mound. The legend was about to be put to the test. In the early evening hours of June 8, 1966, air raid sirens blared throughout Topeka, Kansas. The National Weather Service confirmed that a huge tornado was churning towards Burnett's Mound on the city's southwest side. Weather spotters, including local police, were ordered off the mound.
Big one out there? Yeah, I'd advise you to get off that mound. 45 is getting off the mound headquarters. This thing's coming in a little faster than I think either one of us would anticipate right now.
As I was exiting Mound, I passed one of the local radio station vehicles. on his way up. And I rolled the window down and tried to get his attention, you know, don't go up there. But he didn't see me. He went on up.
In the news vehicle, 19-year-old Rick Douglas was headed towards the top of Burnett's Mound. He had volunteered to do live radio reports about the storm from the peak of the hill. Douglas couldn't hear the sirens over the hail and the static on his two-way radio.
It was very dark, and there were just little pea-sized hailstones hitting the windshield of the news cruiser. And as I got to the vantage point, the grapefruit-sized hail was beginning to really pelt the car.
The funnel had just ripped through a horse farm, tearing up acres of fence. Now the debris was airborne. Douglas didn't realize he was in danger until the evidence was right in front of him.
These boards were starting to rotate vertically in front of the windshield of the news car. And I began to get the picture at this point. This is a funnel. So I turned around and I started back down this switchback road, and I called in to take a live report on the air.
From their house at the foot of the mound, Peg and Paul Marmot were listening to Douglas's update as he raced the funnel down the mound.
He stayed till the very last second, and he said, "For God's sakes, get under something heavy."
Peg and Paul's options were limited. They didn't have a basement, and there clearly wasn't enough time to outrun the black cloud. They watched in terror as houses just up the hill from them were blown apart.
We could see the debris flying off the apartments at this point, which was about maybe less than a quarter of a mile from our house, and heading on an angle right at us.
Just a few blocks from the Marmot's house, Rick Douglas stopped his car to make another live broadcast. He quickly realized the threat was still imminent.
As I stood outside the news car, I watched a house being picked up, flipped up in the air, and exploded into confetti. I ran across the street, and I tried my best to get up under the bridge. And I couldn't climb up this slimy hill. The next thing I know, I'm up in the air. I can see my feet, and I'm not touching the ground.
The tornado dropped Douglas a block away from the overpass. Stunned but conscious, he watched the funnel chew its way down the hill.
It's everything they say. It's jet planes, it's thundering herds, it's freight trains, it's all that and more. It's really, really intense. It moves the ground, it shakes you to your bones.
The huge tornado roared into houses near the bottom of the hill. From their window, Peg and Paul watched the home across the street explode.
We looked at each other, and I told him, I said, "We're going to die." I said, "There's no way anybody can live through that."
When the twister hit the house across the street, they dove under the only protection they had, a wooden end table. As they crouched in fear, their house disintegrated above their heads.
It was totally terrifying. And we kept our heads down, and I don't remember seeing anything because I probably shut my eyes. I just remember hearing. It was a tremendous roar that I'll never forget as long as I live.
At the WIBW TV station, anchorman Bill Curtis received a report that homes and apartment buildings on the southwest side of Topeka had been completely annihilated by the tornado. He had to send out an alert to the rest of the city, one that people would pay attention to after years of watches and warnings that turned out to be false alarms.
I knew at age 26 that the next few words that I would say would mean life and death. In a flash, I thought, do I cry to make the point? Because I was welling up inside. I think the way you kind of become hysterical. 2, do I cuss? How do I really tell people it's no longer a warning, it's an alert? You must get to the basement right now if you want to save your life.
It's in this part of the city right now, 17th and Webster. At least one house was demolished there. Now all we can do, and the best service we can perform now, is to, I hope you have gotten the message by now, for the east part of Topeka, it should be alerted. The entire city was alerted earlier. It is now moving toward the north part of the city. If you live in the north part or on the northern edge, for God's sake, take cover.
Curtis's message was personal. His wife and 6-month-old daughter were at their apartment on the Washburn University campus, which was now directly in the path of the tornado.
I had told my wife, don't worry, I'll call you if there's anything really serious. Well, whether it was the ashen look on my face or the seriousness of the tone, my wife got the message, grabbed our daughter, headed up to the science building, along with everyone else on campus, to get down into the basement.
At that moment, 13-year-old Irma Kimball and her family were in McVicker Chapel on the Washburn campus to attend her flute recital.
And no sooner had we gotten ready to begin when the siren sounded. I think a few people debated about whether or not we should go to the basement, but my instructor said, no, without a doubt, we need to go there at least until the storm passes. So everybody gathered their instruments and programs and headed on downstairs.
The group tried 3 different rooms before they could find a properly tuned piano and continue the recital. Irma's father stood watch by the window.
The atmosphere outside changed. It had been this pinkish, greenish gray color in the sky, and there'd been a light rain. And the sky started to turn dark, and the rain became more forceful.
29-year-old John Fernstrom, a banker, was also on campus that day. He and 25 other people were on the 2nd floor of the Carnegie Building, taking a test for a continuing education program. Most were aware of the tornado watch, but decided to disregard the sirens. Soon they heard another sound, one they couldn't ignore.
It was kind of like a grinding noise, And what we were hearing, but we didn't know at the time, was it was crunching up trees and houses and cars and everything, pulverizing everything in its path.
The noise was soon punctuated by the crash of falling stones. The horrified students realized the tornado was real and had hit the campus. Suddenly, there was a mad dash for the basement.
Everybody just flew down the stairs, taking 2 or 3 and kind of falling and stumbling, whatever, and we got down there, and I remember looking over my shoulder. The ladies' gymnasium had red tile roof, and honestly, I tell you the truth, the tiles just flew off like a magic carpet, and all together. And so then I saw some cars flying by the window, and I knew that we must be really in trouble.
Fernstrom and the other students huddled together in the center of the basement as the monster storm tore into the building over their heads.
Everybody was screaming and hollering and crying and everything, We thought the building was going to come down on us. Everybody was just scared to death. We really thought we were going to die.
At the music recital, the 2nd song was just beginning when Irma's father, standing watch by the window, saw the buildings nearby being ripped apart.
He said the stones and columns, it just kind of broke apart and it floated through the air as if they were feathers. I mean, they were huge stones, but they just were flying, effortlessly. And at that point, the lights flickered and it became dark. And there was, of course, the loud roar of the tornado. Everybody at that point knew it was time to take cover.
Frantic parents tried to shield their children with their own bodies. Irma and several others dove under the piano.
I remember the darkness. I remember hearing the roar and then suddenly not being able to hear anything, and the feeling of your skin being like sandblasted from all the dirt and debris, and thinking too that here we all were lying under this grand piano and hoping that maybe the legs would hold and it wouldn't fall upon us.
The tornado roared on, leaving the huge stone buildings of the campus in ruins.
As quickly as it came upon us, well, then it subsided, and but you could hear that going off and getting softer and softer as it went across Topeka.
The tornado had rolled right over the very hill that legend said would protect the city. Downtown Topeka and the state capitol building now lay in its path. On June 8, 1966, a tornado ravaged neighborhoods in Topeka, Kansas, and was now grinding its way toward the city's downtown. Laura Dalrymple was on duty that night as an operator for Bell Telephone. Her office was across the street from the state capitol building.
I started noticing I had a dead circuit, a red light, on my board. And all of a sudden I got another red light, and I'm getting another dead circuit. And I can't figure out what is happening.
The wail of the sirens couldn't be heard in the soundproof room where Laura and 50 other operators were working. Although she knew that there had been a tornado in nearby Manhattan, Kansas, Laura had no idea that Topeka was under alert. Suddenly, Laura heard a commotion. A coworker who had gone outside on her break saw the tornado bearing down on their building.
She was running in and really hysterical. And she says, "It's coming, it's coming, it's coming."
Before they had time to react, the building was hit.
But I began to feel that the pressure in the room is starting to change. And as the pressure changed, it is getting very hot.
The tornado blew past them, causing little damage, but hysteria grew as the operators realized their families were out there somewhere in the stricken city.
They were so panicked at that point about their families, but they stayed. We knew it was our job, and we knew that we were the only communication system for Topeka.
The operators remained at their posts. Close to downtown in East Topeka, Lanny Ellis and his brother Darrell were at work in their pawn shop. When they heard the sirens go off, they turned on the TVs for sale in the shop.
Television broke in their programming. Bill Curtis was with WIBW at that time, and that's where he came on, and we were glued to that screen to see what was really happening.
We tried to track it as best we could from pieces of observations. From that point, on a 12-mile journey straight through Washburn to the other side of town. It was a half-block wide that was just marching like this huge bulldozer through the town.
The tornado was tearing into downtown and the train depot near Lanny's shop. Lanny and his brother ran for shelter.
There was no basement, no crawl space or anything close in that building to take cover with. So we just went to the back room and got underneath I was holding on to the two legs of a sewing machine table.
Terrified, the two brothers huddled together as the funnel plowed into the building.
Once the glass starts breaking and the roof itself was being ripped off, I mean, it's scary. It's kind of hard to describe how frightening it could be because you don't know what's going to happen the next second.
Lanny and his brother were spared. The tornado raced on, ripping through neighborhoods as it approached the eastern edge of the city. It was headed towards the municipal airport and the National Weather Service building. Meteorologists who had sent out the warning to take cover were now in danger themselves. They watched the radar in horror as the funnel closed in on them.
People that were putting out the warnings The forecasters and some of the radio broadcasters were there too. They transmitted right from the office, took refuge under the desks and wherever they could find, because they saw it coming. They didn't know whether it was going to go immediately over the building or not.
The tornado has just passed over the Weather Bureau office. The majority of us were taking cover at the time. It did break out several windows here. Many, many planes are strewn across the airfield, and at least one airplane is afire. Several cars were damaged. I've never seen such a sight in my life.
As it reached the edge of the airfield, the dark cloud narrowed, thinned, then evaporated in a white wisp. It was 7:29 p.m. The tornado had been on the ground for 34 minutes, carving a path of destruction from one edge of Topeka to the other. Reports of damage were coming in from neighborhoods all across the city.
At that point, we really didn't know how bad it was, but we did know that the emergency units were asking us to call for chainsaws, call for ambulances, the National Guard units from out of town to come in. We need you in the capital. I always get a little teary thinking back, because it was a moment when we really needed people.
Hundreds were trapped in their homes. Most communication was down. Live wires and open gas lines lay exposed in the streets. The chaos would only get worse as night fell on the devastated city. By 7:30 p.m. on June 8, 1966, a devastating tornado had ripped through Topeka, Kansas. The sun was setting as people started to dig out of the rubble.
There are the stages that they go through of grief. One is a carnival stage, almost happy to be alive, laughing, even though their house may be gone, dancing on the slab, that the family is safe. Then it's the realization, as depression sets in, that I've lost everything.
Peg and Paul Marmot crawled out of the ruins of their home and witnessed an incredible sight.
Not only are you looking up into blue sky, which is just inconceivable that you can lose an entire house off the top of your head, but then also just to see the total destruction of everything. It was a scene like that you could never imagine in your wildest dreams, because everything that we had worked for and saved for and planned for was totally gone.
Other parts of town had been hit hard as well. At Washburn University, all the major buildings were damaged or destroyed. Survivors who had taken refuge in the basements of the massive structures were now buried beneath tons of crushed stone. John Fernstrom and his classmates were trapped inside this building. The doorway was blocked, so the students tried to climb through a broken window.
We tried to get out the window, and I heard and the electrical wires were dancing around. And I remember screaming, "Now we made it this far, let's don't get electrocuted now."
They found a way out of another window and emerged to find the campus a twisted jumble of broken tree limbs, ragged stones, and mangled metal. The only sound was the blare of horns from crushed vehicles. Then, Fernstrom heard something else.
We could hear people crying for help over at McVicker Chapel. Just the walls and some jagged pieces of window were all that was left, and we couldn't even get over there because of all of the debris.
Inside the chapel's basement, Irma Kimball had survived the tornado by taking refuge under this piano. After the wind subsided, her first thought was to find her parents, who had come with her to the recital.
Once it was over, everybody emerged from their hiding places, and I found my mother, and everybody was, hugging one another.
Irma's father pried a window out of its frame, and everyone crawled through it. When she got outside and saw the collapsed building, Irma realized just how narrowly they had escaped disaster. The room that they had chosen, because the piano there was in tune, was the only one that was not completely crushed under the fallen stone. In East Topeka, Lanny Ellis and his brother climbed from their hiding place in the wreckage of their pawn shop. The bottling company that stood back to back with Lanny's shop was gone. Only the section of wall where Lanny had hidden was left standing.
The strength of the tornado hit the back of the bottling company building, and then it looked like it flattened out, took everything up above, and then went on across the road, the street, and set back down and did its thing again.
They had survived, but now their livelihood was being threatened. People were trying to force their way through the broken windows in search of valuables. Lanny and his brother chased the looters away, but with nightfall approaching, they were afraid thieves might return. Their inventory provided them with all the protection they needed.
We just took ammunition from the shelves and loaded the guns and put them on and said, let's carry them around. If we have to, we'll have to protect what we have.
Lanny and his brother guarded the shop the entire night. The threat of more looting forced them to camp out in their damaged building for weeks to come. Homes and businesses all through the city lay wide open and vulnerable to thieves. As darkness fell, Mayor Chuck Wright issued a decree. Looters would be shot on sight. The Kansas National Guard was called out to help control the chaos in the streets.
We had to get the injured taken care of. Everybody, the police department, the fire department, all the city employees, even the state employees, people from the towns around, they came to our rescue.
As the search for the missing continued, the streets, already clogged with debris, were flooded with sightseers. Rescue efforts were being hampered.
The sightseers, the minute it was over, everybody seemed like got in their car to drive through these areas. There were open power lines that were sparking, and gas lines were broken, water lines. And we had a hard time getting the injured out and getting them to hospitals.
Friends and relatives searching for loved ones were also jamming the streets. Local television reporters went on the air to warn viewers to stay away.
To the left of me is a power line that's sparking. Straight in front of me is a water pipe that's shooting up into the air, and I'm told there are gas lines all the way through here. In front of me now, there are probably 500 people milling through all of this destruction. You see children, 7 and 8 years old, walking around barefooted down here. Now, this is ridiculous.
Everybody had a friend or a relative living in the capital, and they wanted to know, are they okay? And so we started reading names of people who were okay, who managed to get their name to us. We stayed on the air for 24 straight hours.
Anchorman Bill Curtis didn't know if his wife and baby daughter had survived the storm.
I called my house, and our neighbor was there, and it got through for some reason to make sure that my wife and baby were all right, because I was ready to leave and go there, and they said, they're okay, you go ahead and do your job. And so I stayed.
Radio station WREN was desperately looking for one of its own employees. Listeners had heard Rick Douglas's frantic broadcast from Burnett's Mound. No one knew what had happened to Douglas or whether he was even alive. The station manager, Max Falkenstein, made a plea to his audience.
He was on the air saying, if Rick Douglas is out there and you have lost radio communication, please call in by landline. We've lost contact with you, or if anybody has seen, Rick, please let us know his whereabouts.
Rick was alive, but injured. He had been taken to one of the local hospitals. Doctors, nurses, and volunteers were overwhelmed with victims who filled every corner of the emergency room.
There were gurneys and people being treated all over the sofas in the lobby of the hospital. I think the street lights or whatever light they could, drag in there were being used to illuminate the lobby, and they were trying to see who needed attention the most.
Rick was covered in mud, broken glass, and splinters, and had a gash in his leg that was bleeding profusely.
Some nurse or some aide came by and covered my head once. She thought I was dead. And when I pulled the sheet back, she winced a little bit.
Douglas made a full recovery, but for more than a dozen years afterward, he found small splinters and shards of glass still embedded in his skin. His strongest memory of his encounter with the tornado is not the incredible sights or the painful injuries, but the unusual smell that clung to his skin for weeks.
It was a mixture of blood and guts and wood and metal, all sorts of things that rot and fester. I lived with that, of course, on my body for quite a while. No amount of cleaning will take that away.
It was cleanup time for Topeka as well. After a long, dark night, survivors would finally see how much of their city had been swallowed by the storm. At daybreak on Thursday, June 9th, 1966, residents of Topeka, Kansas got their first look at the handiwork of the deadly tornado. Mayor Chuck Wright surveyed the city from a National Guard helicopter.
I flew over the area at 6 o'clock, and I'm not afraid to say it, I cried. It was just so awesome. It looked like somebody had taken a 6-block wide lawnmower and gone right through the heart of the city.
The trail of devastation stretched over 22 miles of the city. In some areas, it was over half a mile wide. The trail started at Burnett's Mound on the city's southwest side. The homes below the hill were gone, stripped to their foundations. Washburn University and the neighborhood surrounding it were annihilated.
The tornado blew out a science building, knocked down most of the buildings on campus, and yet our little $60 a month apartment, 2 rooms, stood. There are stories like that throughout the city, of one house fully intact, hardly a mark, one next door totally gone. Very easy to get emotional and religious about these things, and yet it's the randomness of nature that can only explain it.
The path continued into downtown. The transportation barn was crushed, the buses flattened and thrown into piles. The train cars at the Santa Fe rail yard were overturned by the fierce, nearly 300-mile-per-hour winds. Even the symbol of downtown Topeka, the state capitol building, had a gaping hole in its dome. East Topeka was also struck hard. Entire neighborhoods wiped off the map.
As it went through the east part of town and the central part of town, it was hitting less expensive housing. It was hitting smaller houses that were closer together. The folks per block in East Topeka probably had a lot more dwelling units destroyed than they did in the southwest part of town.
The monetary loss was calculated at over $100 million, the most damaging tornado at that time in history. President Lyndon Johnson quickly declared Topeka a federal disaster area.
As the first reports came in, the damage was so bad. Everyone expected that there must have been hundreds of deaths and thousands of injuries. Everyone thought there's no way you can have such terrible, terrible property destruction and not have killed hundreds of people. But somehow, it didn't happen.
Incredibly, only 16 lives were lost. Experts estimate that as many as 5,000 people would have been killed if the tornado had struck during working hours or in the middle of the night. Since it hit during dinner time, most people were home to hear the early warning on their televisions and radios. Grateful residents praised the local media, including anchorman Bill Curtis, for saving lives.
People in Topeka who are used to, when they hear the tornado sirens, walk outside the doors and look at the sky instead of go to the basement, heard him say, "For God's sake, take cover," and figured it must be serious if somebody said that in 1966 on my television set, and they really did go to the basement, and that had to have saved an awful lot of lives.
For God's sake, take cover.
Strangely, however, I was the lucky one. I was never in danger. I never saw the tornado. It was a break for me in my career. If I was looking for a sign to help me choose between law and broadcasting, this was as big as you could get.
Topeka began the long process of rebuilding. Volunteers came from all across America to help the city back on its feet. Within a week, utilities had been restored. Donations of food and clothing poured into relief centers. Temporary housing was brought in to accommodate the 3,500 people who were now homeless. Reconstruction was not so easy for the less prosperous areas in the city's downtown and east side. Not only was the financial strain great, but the emotional strain was too much for some to bear.
We had certainly people that decided never to rebuild. They associated the horror of what had happened with their home, or what was left of their home, and they couldn't go back and live in that home again. A tornado doesn't just change the face of the ground when it hits it. The social changes keep changing it for years afterwards.
Many Topekans believe more strongly than ever in the Native American legend of Burnett's Mound. They insist that the water tower, built on the sacred hill just a few years before the tornado, provoked the wrath of the ancient deities.
After you've had a killer tornado, I mean, it literally comes right over the mound and goes 22 miles through the city from one corner to the other. Anybody that's looking for a reason is going to look at the easiest one, and the easiest one is, we made the Indians mad.
It made for a great story coming off the Indian burial mound. Believe what you want, the fact is that the tornado came right over the mound, right over the water tower that had been built on the mound, and used it as the starting point for its path of destruction.
If the tragedy of June 1966 proved to strengthen one myth, it helped to demolish another one. Topekans had thought the mound would act as a physical barrier and prevent tornadoes from rolling into the city.
No land feature, no city, nothing is going to change the direction of the tornado. The intensity, the energy that's being moved out of the atmosphere is so great that it will move across any area. And of course, Burnett's Mound proved that.
In fact, at least one American city is hit by a tornado each year. Whether Topekans believe the tornado that struck that June day in 1966 was the fury of angry spirits or an act of brutal nature, they will never forget it.
I know that it haunts the city. It will haunt the city for another generation. It was an amazingly frightening thing. You hear about people saying a tornado is like the sound of a train coming through. Well, we have 125,000 people that will tell you that's true.